The Castlevania series is perhaps one of the most well-loved series of all time. It was a surprise then that we had to wait so long to get a Castlevania game on the Nintendo 64. Even more surprising considering how many games Konami released on the console before they pulled an ace from their sleeve and announced that for the very first time the series would be entering the third dimension. Developed and published by Konami in 1999 in all regions, Castlevania was in development for over 2 years, and it's fair to say it didn't go smoothly. Development of the game was dealt with by Konami's Kobe studio, and the game was teased as Castlevania 64 at the 1997 Tokyo Game Show with an infamous trailer which caught everyone's attention. It's said that by September of 1997 the game was still only 10% complete, and it took a further 5 months to reach 20%. And it began to go by the name of Dracula 3D at this point. At the following year's Tokyo Game Show, the game did have some playable levels and was well received by those in attendance, but the biggest problem was just how far the game was behind in development. The original intention for the game was to have 4 playable characters whose storylines would intertwine with one another to create one final epic finale. Each character had their own story path and ending, but you'd only been able to see the full ending when the game was completed with all 4 characters. Realising this complex mechanic and creating 4 storylines was causing the delays, Konami made a decision to cut 2 of the characters from the game in order to streamline the development, and also to be in a position where they could announce a release date. They were however able to revisit this idea with Legacy of Darkness, which I'll come to in another review. Now off the bat, this game isn't Symphony of the Night, which is the vastly superior title. What Castlevania offers is an alternative experience, and so whilst many people will often say the PlayStation got the superior game, which I will agree with, it's not to say that there's nothing redeeming to play here. The story begins with Dracula Awakening in 1852 after around 60 years due to the rising horrors of mankind in the world. 2 heroes sense his return, and no surprise they're the 2 characters that you'll get to choose from. Reinhardt is the heir to the old Belmont clan of vampire hunters, and Carrie Fernandez has magical powers which she plans to use for the good of the world. They both set out for Transylvania, and so your quest begins. And whilst I personally enjoyed the overall story, which is packed with twists and turns, I felt that more could have been done to flesh out the characters' backstories. Whilst the characters take similar paths at time with their own stages along the way, I personally would have liked perhaps a prologue style level to start their journeys in the actual village below Castlevania, where you could interact with NPCs to get a better sense of the peril that awaits you. Castlevania instead drops you straight into the action from the moment you play. Now this could be a throwback to the older Castlevania titles, which were much more linear experiences, but with the added abilities of developing for the console, it seems to have been a missed opportunity to really inject some sense of purpose at the start of the game. On a positive note however, the opening level does a really great job of thrusting you into learning your character's combat mechanics, and I can't think of any other game which throws you up against a mini-boss so quickly. The story does develop during the game as you come across various characters who will aid you in your quest, and each other character has 2 different endings depending on your own progression through the game. Avoiding spoilers, which I know you all hate, I will say that the game is worth playing through at least once with each character as a minimum, and so the amount of gameplay you'll get from the title makes it a worthwhile payoff. Whilst at first glance a game appears to be a simple platform action game, the gameplay is often broken up with some RPG-like elements. At various points in the game the action will take a back seat, whilst you need to explore your surroundings to gather information from characters, solve some fairly basic puzzles, and to find items to open up your next area. Whilst I may be alone in this thought, I'd also say there is some basic survival horror elements too. Again, there are times in the game where you'll either be trapped or locked in an area, and you'll be unable to leave until you've killed all of the enemies around you. Of course, this sense of anxiety can be reduced if you've stocked up on power-ups, which you can buy from Renan, who is a demonic salesman. And stocking up is something that I suggest you do because perhaps the items he has available for sale will greatly aid you in your quest. Most notably, by him selling purification items. In the game you'll often come across vampire enemies who will not only want to beat you to a pulp, they'll also want to suck your blood. Once they latch onto you, you'll have a limited amount of time to shake them off before you yourself will become infected. Being infected limits your abilities and starts a countdown before you'll become one of them fully and the game will be over. You'll also be able to pick up sun and moon cards from Renan, which play an important part in the game. As the game progresses, it cycles through a day and night cycle, and certain events in the game can only be actioned at specific times of day. This could be something as simple as being able to move a block or open a door, but other storyline specific events will only take place at the right time of day. Take for example when you need to meet Rosa in the villa. She's the beautiful vampire who is fully aware of what she's become and lives in turmoil contemplating her existence. Being a vampire, she'll not be around during the daytime, and so in order to meet her, you'll either need to hang around until nightfall or use a moon card to turn the day into night to speak to her in the courtyard. Whilst it may sound tedious on paper, in reality it's often dealt with perfectly, and in another cool twist, the game is also counting how many days it takes you to reach Dracula. I won't make any spoilers again, but let's just say the quicker you get to Dracula, the more epic the game's finale is. Again, it's another reason for multiple playthroughs, and if you don't quite manage to snag the good ending in the game, it gives you a reason to go back and play the entire experience from start to finish once more. I also really enjoyed the combat in the game. You have your core weapons, which are the whip with Reinhardt and magic with Carrie, as well as a secondary melee weapon and other projectile weapons you can pick up during the game. There's also power-ups to collect to improve your attack damage, and red jewels which you'll need to keep a good stock of to use the projectile weapons. Sadly though, the North American and PAL versions of the game don't have on-cart saves, and so you will need to be using a memory pack when playing this title. With 14 stages across the two characters in the game, there's plenty of action and varying environments. Backtracking is also limited in its use, and so the game continually feels fresh in terms of the areas you'll be playing in, and the pacing of the game from start to finish is fairly good. What makes the game slow down at times, however, are the challenging platform sections. At far too many points in the game, there are areas which will require pinpoint jumping. Without a double jump in the game, it's a case of one mistake and you're often falling many levels to your death, or ending up in a pool of toxic liquid which leads to a game over screen. I urge you to watch some of the many speedruns of this game, which are still very popular to this day, and they'll give you a whole sense of appreciation for how good they are once you've tried this game yourself. There are also some glaring things which Konami missed the boat on, such as having no areas where you'll use Reinhardt's whip to cross larger areas. We did get our fix for that with Indiana Jones on the N64, but this is a staple of the series and something that many long-term fans would have expected, and it seems an odd decision that they didn't make use of this. Likewise, targeting enemies is based on the area that you're facing. A Zelda-like lock-on system would have been ideal here, and many times you'll be attacking the wrong enemy simply because the lock-on isn't selecting the enemy that you actually want to attack. Whilst I praise the art style for capturing the gothic style and the cool and creative enemies, and again some of these are updates to 2D favourites, the actual graphics in the game seem out of place for a 1999 release. There's no expansion pack support, so the textures are standard resolution, and sadly that means the entire game has quite a blurry look to it. Now this is common with N64 games as we know, but Konami were one of the worst culprits for this with all of their titles on the console. They never really seemed to get to grips with how to get the system's strengths into their games. Frame rates too take a hit with multiple enemies on the screen, and there's fogging to mask out areas. Now the fogging actually works really well in the external areas as it adds a sense of atmosphere, but internally it doesn't work, and combined with the small amount of pop-up it drags down the overall package. I do though think that the graphics get better as the game progresses, and there are some pretty awesome looking areas later in the game, but it's the bosses where I feel the game really delivers in the Castlevania feel. They are quite honestly awesome and very fun to play. Now they aren't overly difficult, until the end of the game at least, but they do create huge epic battles where the bosses can at times fill the entire screen. It helps to add a sense of scale, and there are some occasional lighting effects to further enhance the visuals, but sadly not quite enough of them to make the game feel as scary as it perhaps should have been. The game's audio will divide opinion just as much as the actual game itself. My opinion is that the soundtrack is excellent, but as you may know from other reviews I've done, I tend to prefer and get a kick out of more ambient scores, and I prefer a limited use of epic pieces of music in games. Castlevania delivers for me in that regard, and some areas in the game even have no music whatsoever, leaving you with just the sound effects to build the tension and atmosphere. The effects are superbly done, and like some of my other favourite Konami games like Hybrid Heaven and the Goemon games, they have a great job here of creating the effects which sound clear and are of a higher quality. There will be some long-term Castlevania fans that will be disappointed with the music though. Many of the classic Castlevania pieces of music which we all know and love are not present here. This may seem like a strange choice, and perhaps it is, but I personally feel that this was to set the game apart as its own start to the new series of 3D Castlevania games. It wanted to create its own classical pieces, which I think it missed the boat on fully, but that's only because the 8 and 16-bit games were such instant classics in terms of their music. There must be fans of this soundtrack like me however, because the game's soundtrack did get a CD release in Japan, and with over an hour's worth of music, it's worth seeking out for any Castlevania collectors or those that like a more subtle soundtrack than the loud in-your-face style. When you first hear the opposing Bloodlines violin piece of music in the game's opening sequence, you'll pretty much know what to expect for the rest of the game. Overall though, Castlevania is a very enjoyable game. You'll just need to manage your expectations. Like many franchises which jumped from 2D to 3D at the time, the game does a great job, but it never quite mastered the transition. What you're left with is a game which does, I feel, all that it can to become the 3D Castlevania that people wanted, and I think had Symphony of the Night not been released years before, or if it hadn't have actually been that great, then Castlevania on the N64 would be more fondly remembered. The game did receive generally positive reviews on its launch, and whilst many reviewers of the time were disappointed that 2 characters were pulled from the game, they said that their worries about the game's long development problems were unfounded. The fiddly camera in the game is a constant battle which they all picked up on, and I admit it that they will cause you lots of death throughout the entire game. However, I feel that if you play a lot of early 3D titles, and this is something that you'll have already been accustomed to, and you may be able to work through as you progress through the game. With branching storylines, multiple endings, cool character and enemy designs, as well as some awesome cinematic storyline twists, I can't help but recommend Castlevania. The problem is, however, is that Legacy of Darkness is the true Castlevania to play on the N64. Now I'll eventually get around to covering that, but had Castlevania been the only N64 release, it would have been an instant buy for anyone looking for a cool horror adventure title. With Legacy of Darkness though, you may want to hold off purchasing for another time until I've covered that game, because as I said, that is the more vastly superior title. And so for today's topic of conversation, I'd love to know your favourite Castlevania game on any platform. Whilst I love the original, I also enjoyed the newer releases, which I know also divide opinion. I'd also love to know who your favourite character to play as in this game is. I'm guessing for many it will be Carrie, who is the speedrunner's choice, but I personally always found Reinhardt the more interesting character. But as always, thank you for watching, and until next time.